The tanker had been running without a flag for 11 days before the interdiction. A 280,000-ton crude carrier, riding low in the water with a full load of petroleum product destined for a port that 3 consecutive sanctions regimes had placed beyond the legal reach of Iranian state-owned shipping enterprises. The vessel had changed its AIS transponder identifier 4 times in the previous 30 days, cycling through registration numbers associated with shell companies registered in the Marshall Islands, the Comoros, and a third jurisdiction whose maritime authority had not responded to any communication from any international body in over a year. The cargo documentation listed the origin port as a Basra facility. The satellite imagery assembled by the intelligence package told a different story. The vessel had spent 48 hours at anchor in Iranian territorial waters 6 days before its current position, taking on the load that its paperwork claimed had been lifted from Iraqi infrastructure. The boarding team had gone over the side at 6:14 a.m. in the Gulf of Oman, 37 nautical miles southeast of the Omani coastline, under a sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east, with the first gray suggestion of dawn. The operation had been clean and swift. The tanker's crew had not resisted. The vessel's master had handed over the documentation without being asked twice, which suggested either that he understood the legal weight of his situation completely or that he had been expecting exactly this moment for longer than the interdiction team had been tracking the vessel. The boarding team secured the bridge and engineering spaces, confirmed the cargo manifest against the satellite intelligence product, and transmitted the seizure notification to 5th Fleet Headquarters at 6:31 a.m. By 6:33 a.m., the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs had issued a formal protest through its official communications channels. By 7:02 a.m., the IRGC Navy's Maritime Operations Center at Bandar Abbas had issued movement orders. The USS guided missile frigate assigned as escort for the prize crew operation had been positioned 4.2 nautical miles off the tanker's port beam since 5:40 a.m., running a circular screening pattern while the boarding operation proceeded. The commanding officer had been on the bridge through the entire interdiction sequence, watching the tactical picture with the particular attention of someone who has read every available intelligence product on IRGC response patterns to sanctions enforcement operations, and who understands that the period immediately following a seizure announcement, the window between the moment Tehran receives official notification and the moment it decides how to respond kinetically, is the most dangerous interval in the entire operation. Not the boarding itself, not the transit. The gap between the notification and the response. That is when the geometry is still forming and all the options are still theoretically available to the adversary, which means it is the interval during which the adversary is most likely to act on the options that, once the geometry is locked, would be foreclosed. The frigate adjusted its screening pattern at 7:08 a.m., moving to a closer orbit of 2.1 nautical miles off the tanker's port beam as the prize crew completed their initial systems assessment and the tanker began making turns for the escort transit to the designated custody port. The tanker's speed was limited by its engineering configuration and its current load displacement to approximately 11 knots maximum sustainable, which meant the transit would be long, slow, and conducted in sea space that the IRGC Navy's patrol radius covered with comfortable margin. The commanding officer understood the arithmetic of what that meant for the next 18 to 24 hours with the clarity of someone who was already preparing for it. At 8:17 a.m., the first contact appeared on the surface plot at bearing 019 degrees, range 44 nautical miles. A single vessel, moving fast on a southwest heading, 31 knots. No AIS. The watch team logged it and assigned it a tentative classification based on radar cross-section, probable frigate-class hull. Iranian Navy. The commanding officer acknowledged the report and said nothing beyond the standard watch exchange. 44 miles was distance. Distance was time. Time was preparation. At 8:44 a.m., a second contact appeared at bearing 031 degrees, range 52 nautical miles. Similar speed. Similar radar profile. The two contacts were on slightly diverging headings that when projected forward at their current speeds, would resolve into a two-axis approach on the tanker's projected track within approximately 90 minutes. The frigate's Combat Information Center had been at elevated readiness since the seizure notification went out. The Tactical Action Officer had his weapon systems in active standby, his radar picture at full output power, and his electronic warfare suite running passive collection on every emission in the operational area. The space smelled of overprocessed air and the specific human heat generated by a watch team that has been at peak alertness for 3 hours and knows it will be at peak alertness for several more. The deck plates transmitted the low-frequency vibration of the frigate's own propulsion plant with a steadiness that the watch team no longer consciously registered. It was simply part of the environment, like the hum of the electronics consoles and the movement of the ship through the modest swell running from the northeast. At 9:03 a.m., the air picture changed. 4 contacts, small and fast, appeared on the radar at bearing 355 degrees, range 28 nautical miles. Their radar cross-sections were consistent with medium-category unmanned aerial vehicles. Speed approximately 160 knots. Altitude variable between 800 and 1,400 feet, with the altitude variation suggesting they were not on a fixed cruise profile, but on an actively managed approach geometry designed to complicate the engagement picture. They were approaching on a bearing that placed them on a direct intercept course with the tanker, not the frigate. The targeting selection was deliberate and communicated a specific strategic intent. The vessel being threatened was not the warship. It was the prize, the asset whose loss or damage would constitute the operational reversal of the interdiction action. The IRGC had made a calculation. A UAV strike against the frigate would be absorbed as a military engagement and would harden American resolve. A UAV strike against the tanker, against its bridge structure, its deck equipment, its cargo handling systems, would complicate the legal standing of the seizure, damage the prize crew's ability to navigate the vessel, and potentially force a decision between continuing the transit under degraded conditions or abandoning the prize in sea space, where Iranian naval vessels could reclaim it before an alternative escort package could be organized. The targets were chosen to attack the logic of the operation, not just its hardware. The commanding officer ordered the frigate to close the tanker's position at flank speed at 9:04 a.m., reducing the escort orbit radius to 0.8 nautical miles. Closer, tighter, interposing the frigate's own defensive envelope more completely over the tanker's position. The tanker's prize crew, a team of 8 personnel from the boarding package, now managing a 280,000-ton vessel with engineering systems they had been familiarizing themselves with for less than 3 hours, received notification of the air threat through the secure communications link and were instructed to maintain course and speed and to stay away from exposed deck positions. At 9:08 a.m., the MH-60R Seahawk helicopter assigned to the frigate's surface and air warfare screening mission received new tasking. The crew had been running a wide orbit pattern 14 nautical miles ahead of the formation, watching the surface picture with its targeting pod. Now they were redirected to the north, toward the inbound UAV formation, with instructions to establish visual identification on the contacts and report their configuration. The crew descended to 600 feet and accelerated to intercept. At 9:11 a.m., the pilot reported visual acquisition on the lead element, 4 airframes in a staggered column formation, each carrying what appeared to be a forward-mounted payload section consistent with a loitering munition configuration, not reconnaissance variants. These were systems designed to find a target and remain on station until directed to impact it, or until their fuel states forced a terminal engagement. The identification report changed the engagement category. These were not sensor platforms. They were armed systems on an active approach vector toward a vessel with prize crew personnel aboard. The Tactical Action Officer transmitted an engagement authority request to the commanding officer at 9:12 a.m. Authorization came back in 11 seconds. The ram launcher mounted on the frigate's aft deck station, the rolling airframe missile system that uses passive radio frequency and infrared homing to prosecute small, low-altitude air threats, elevated to its engagement bearing and locked acquisition on the lead UAV contact at 9:12:31 a.m. The system had been tracking all 4 contacts on its organic sensor suite since their range had closed to 18 nautical miles. The firing solution was refined, validated, and confirmed. At 9:12:44 a.m., the first rolling airframe missile came off the launcher with a sharp crack that registered through the hull as a single hard impact before the sustainer motor's exhaust plume curved upward and north against the morning sky. The first UAV was neutralized at a range of 9.2 nautical miles from the tanker. The second missile launched at 9:12:51 a.m. This engagement was less clean. The second UAV had detected the first missile's launch, either through its own sensor package or through a data link instruction from the IRGC controller, and had dropped its altitude sharply, transitioning to a sea-skimming profile that placed it below the thermal horizon boundary where the ram seeker's infrared channel had its optimal acquisition geometry. The missile performed 3 course corrections in its terminal phase, each one responding to the updated sensor picture as the seeker head reacquired the contact through the thermal clutter above the water surface. The intercept occurred at 6.7 nautical miles. The fragmentation pattern from the warhead impacted the UAV's airframe structure and its payload section simultaneously. The secondary detonation from the payload was visible from the frigate's bridge as a brief orange flash above the waterline, lasting approximately 2 seconds before the debris field fell into the sea. 2 contacts removed, 2 still inbound. At 9:14 a.m., the electronic warfare suite registered a targeting emission from the surface contact at bearing 019 degrees, the lead IRGC frigate, now at range 31 nautical miles and closing. The emission was classified within 9 seconds. Active fire control radar, consistent with the targeting system integrated into the Iranian Navy's Mawuj-class frigate weapon suite. The IRGC surface element had activated its own targeting radar in coordination with the UAV approach, using the air threat to saturate the defensive picture while the surface vessels advanced to within their own weapons employment range. The UAVs were the first layer of a sequenced attack. The frigates were the second. This was the architecture of the threat. Not a swarm, not a single axis. A timed, sequenced, multi-domain engagement designed to force the frigate's defensive systems and its decision-making chain to process simultaneous air and surface threats, to split cognitive load and weapons inventory across 2 separate engagement tracks at the same moment. The commanding officer did not divide his response. He prioritized the air threat, completed the air engagements, and then addressed the surface picture. The prioritization was doctrine. An armed loitering munition at 12 nautical miles and closing at 160 knots is a faster developing threat than a frigate at 31 nautical miles closing at 28 knots. The physics of the situation determined the sequence. The commanding officer followed the physics. The third UAV maneuvered at 9:14:22 a.m., a hard lateral deviation of 22 degrees. At the moment, the Seahawk crew attempted to establish a laser designation solution from its overhead position. The maneuver was not random. It was a pre-programmed evasion response triggered when the UAV's sensor package detected the laser energy from the helicopter above it. The IRGC engineers had built an evasion library into the system's flight control software, anticipating exactly this kind of airborne laser designation. When the laser detected, turn. Change the intercept geometry, force the targeting solution to be rebuilt from a modified baseline. The Seahawk crew responded within 4 seconds. The pilot executed a banking turn that repositioned the helicopter's laser designation axis to compensate for the UAV's deviation, reacquiring the target on the updated vector. The new solution was transmitted to the RAM launcher's fire control system at 9:14:29 a.m. The third RAM launched at 9:14:31 a.m., 9 seconds after the UAV's evasion maneuver. In those 9 seconds, the UAV had closed 660 yards of additional range toward the tanker. The intercept occurred at 4.4 nautical miles, closer than either of the previous 2 engagements, close enough that the tanker's prize crew, watching from the windows of the navigation bridge, saw the detonation as a visible event on the northern horizon. A white-gray flash at sea level, there and gone, followed by a debris trail that caught the morning light for a moment before falling into the water. The fourth UAV did not maneuver. It accelerated. At 9:14:38 a.m., 7 seconds after the third ram launch, while the fire control system was cycling for the next engagement, the fourth contact went to maximum speed, abandoning its approach profile for a direct terminal run at the tanker's position. Speed jumped from 160 knots to approximately 210 knots. Altitude dropped to 140 feet above the water surface. The targeting sensor on the UAV's nose section went from passive acquisition to active terminal homing. The RAM system required 6.4 seconds to reacquire the fourth contact on its updated speed and altitude profile, refine the new intercept solution, and validate it against the engagement envelope parameters. In those 6.4 seconds, the fourth UAV closed from 11.2 nautical miles to 9.8 nautical miles from the tanker. The solution was validated at 9:14:44 a.m. The fourth ram launched at 9:14:45 a.m. The intercept occurred at 3.1 nautical miles from the tanker's hull. 3.1 nautical miles. In the CIC, where the engagement had been tracked in real time by a watch team operating at the absolute boundary of their trained performance envelope, the range of the final intercept was noted in the tactical log with a timestamp accurate to the second. The number would appear in the operational report, in the post-engagement analysis, in the doctrine review that would follow. It would be read by people who were not present in that space, who would process it as a data point in a larger analysis framework. For the watch team that produced it, it was not a data point. It was a distance that, under marginally different conditions, a slightly faster UAV, a slightly longer reacquisition cycle, a slightly more complex evasion maneuver, would have had a different outcome. 3.1 nautical miles was the margin. The record showed what it was. The watch team knew what it almost was not. Now the surface picture required full attention. The two IRGC frigates had used the 14-minute UAV engagement window to close the range from 44 and 52 nautical miles to 22 and 27 nautical miles respectively. They were now positioned to the north and northeast of the formation on a geometry that bracketed the tanker's projected transit track between their two bearing lines. Their fire control radars were both active. The lead frigate had its targeting radar locked on the prize tanker. The second had its targeting radar locked on the USS frigate. 2 vessels, 2 targeting solutions, 2 sets of weapons ready. The silence on the radio remained total. 14 minutes of UAV engagement, 4 missiles fired, 4 contacts neutralized, and not a single transmission from either IRGC surface vessel on any frequency. Not a declaration, not a warning, not a demand. Just the geometry and the radar emissions, expressing in the language of physics what any communication would have said less precisely. The Seahawk crew received new tasking at 9:29 a.m. The helicopter repositioned from its post-intercept orbit north of the formation to a direct approach on the lead IRGC frigate, descending to 280 feet above the water. The laser designator activated at 9:30:17 a.m., locking onto the frigate's bridge structure and forward missile launcher simultaneously. The dual solution hold covered both the vessel's command capability and its primary offensive system. The beam was invisible to any naked eye watching from the Iranian vessel's deck. It was completely legible to every electro-optical sensor the IRGC frigate carried. A refined, ready targeting solution applied from a helicopter whose crew had demonstrated in the previous 14 minutes that they were capable of precise sensor employment under active tactical conditions. The lead IRGC frigate reduced its targeting radar output at 9:30:41 a.m. Not a complete shutdown, a power reduction of approximately 60% that shifted the emission from active targeting mode to reduced power surveillance mode. The change was detected and logged by the electronic warfare suite. It was not a withdrawal. It was a reduction. But in the geometry of this confrontation, a reduction in targeting radar power by a vessel that had been holding an active fire control lock on a prize tanker for 11 minutes was a measurable change in posture. The commanding officer noted it and maintained course. The second IRGC frigate held its targeting lock on the USS frigate for 4 more minutes. At 9:34 a.m., The EA-18G Growler, assigned to the strike group's electronic attack support mission, which had been on station at altitude 60 nautical miles to the south since the seizure operation began, providing persistent electronic warfare coverage for the interdiction package, received new tasking from 5th Fleet. The aircraft repositioned and began active jamming of the frequency band associated with the IRGC's surface-to-surface missile guidance system. The jamming energy was directional, focused specifically on the 2 IRGC frigate bearings, and operated at a power level sufficient to degrade any guidance uplink to weapons already in flight, not merely to prevent new launch solutions from being established. The Growler was not making an argument. It was closing a door. The second IRGC frigate shut down its targeting radar at 9:35:22 a.m. Both surface contacts began a gradual bearing change to the northwest at 9:37 a.m. Not the sharp, urgent turn of a vessel that has concluded it is about to be engaged. A slow, deliberate heading change that maintained the visual of a formation withdrawing on its own terms at a speed of its choosing, in a direction that kept it within potential re-engagement range for another 40 minutes before the geometry made that option geometrically implausible. The IRGC command understood the optics of withdrawal as well as it understood the tactics of approach. The manner of leaving was part of the message, just as the manner of arriving had been. The frigate held its position between the withdrawing IRGC contacts and the tanker's track, maintaining the 0.8 nautical mile escort orbit until both surface contacts had opened to 35 nautical miles and their bearing rates confirmed they were no longer on an intercept vector with any vessel in the formation. Then, and only then, the commanding officer authorized a return to the standard 2.1 nautical mile screening pattern. The prize crew reported all systems nominal aboard the tanker at 9:41 a.m. The vessel continued on its transit heading at 11 knots, riding low and slow in the Gulf of Oman with its sanctioned cargo and its prize crew and the full operational weight of what had just occurred in the 14 minutes between the first ram launch and the final intercept, playing out in the quiet of the navigation bridge around them. The transit to the custody port would take another 19 hours. At 10:08 a.m., the commanding officer composed the initial engagement report. It was factual, sequential, and precise in its language, because operational reports that will be read by doctrine writers and intelligence analysts and fleet commanders require precision over atmosphere. The report documented the UAV contacts, their approach profiles, their evasion behavior, their terminal acceleration. It documented the 4 ram engagements, the ranges of each intercept, the 6.4-second reacquisition interval that produced the 3.1 nautical mile final intercept range. It documented the IRGC surface elements activation and withdrawal sequence, the Growler's jamming contribution, the Seahawk laser designation timeline, and the cumulative duration of the engagement from first radar contact on the initial surface vessel at 8:17 a.m. to final YRGC surface contact withdrawal at 9:37 a.m. 1 hour and 20 minutes of sustained escalation management. 4 UAVs neutralized. 2 IRGC frigates held at range and withdrawn without kinetic engagement. 1 prize tanker with prize crew intact, continuing transit on planned heading, cargo undamaged, at 11 knots through calm water under a sky that was now fully bright with late morning sun. The costs were enumerated with equal precision. 4 rolling airframe missiles expended at a unit replacement cost that would require a logistics coordination message to the weapon support facility at Bahrain before the ship could be considered fully combat ready for another engagement of this category. The Seahawk crew had been airborne for 2 hours and 47 minutes, inside authorized limits, but requiring rest period compliance before the next tasking cycle. The electronic warfare suite had logged a minor calibration offset on one of its frequency monitoring channels during the Growler's jamming operation. Not a failure, not a casualty, but a precision instrument that had been working in close proximity to high-power jamming energy and required a verification sweep before it could be trusted for confident classification work. The prize crew aboard the tanker had been managing the vessel's engineering systems under active threat conditions for the entire engagement duration. They would need rotation before the next potential threat window during the 19-hour transit. None of this was failure. All of it was cost. cost that had been accepted in advance in planning sessions and equipment budgets and training programs as the predictable arithmetic of interdiction operations in sea space that the IRGC Navy considered its operational domain, regardless of what international maritime law specified about the status of international waters. The interdiction had been conducted lawfully. The prize had been secured lawfully. The transit was proceeding lawfully. And the price of conducting lawful operations in a waterway whose adjacent power has decided to contest them is exactly what the engagement log documented: 4 missiles, 1 Growler sortie, 2 3/4 hours of helicopter flight time, and the specific physiological debt that accumulates in the bodies of a prize crew who spent 89 minutes managing a super tanker while 4 armed systems attempted to reach them from the north. The tanker arrived at the custody port and was formally processed into the legal seizure framework at 11:47 a.m. the following morning. The sanctioned cargo did not reach its intended destination. The IRGC did not recover the vessel. The interdiction was complete. What it cost: 4 missiles, a maintenance cycle on an electronic warfare receiver, 19 hours of escort operations, and a 3.1 nautical mile margin on a final intercept that the watch team will carry with them in the way that professionals carry the closest outcomes of the hardest moments. What it did not cost: the line. Not a single bearing change that had not been planned. Not a single deviation that could be read as evidence of a threshold. Not a single inch that was not already owed to the transit plan. 2 IRGC frigates, 4 armed UAVs, 1 sanctioned tanker, 4 intercepts, 0 course deviations, 1 cargo that did not arrive. The law of the sea holds because someone with a weapon system and the willingness to use it stands between the law and those who have decided the law is optional. The record shows 3.1 nautical miles. It shows 4 for 4. It shows the tanker at the custody port and the cargo logged in the seizure framework. The prize was held. The line was held. And in the contested waterways of the world, where arguments are settled not in courtrooms, but in radar returns and weapons employments and the distance of the final intercept from the vessel being defended, that is the only verdict that has ever mattered.